Welcome to the Criminologist Podcast. Our goal here is to educate and enlighten our listeners, focusing on the latest and greatest evidence-based interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. And not only those factors which drive folks into crime, we also look at the reasons why people exit a life of crime. Also, we attempt to paint an accurate picture of that journey from the perspective of the justice-involved individual. Too often, our perceptions of those involved in the system are tainted by media-driven caricatures created to sell newspapers or movie tickets. This adds little to a healthy dialogue as to how to best address criminality. This podcast will avoid stereotypes and biases. We will endeavor to accomplish the first two goals in a way that keep you, the listener, interested and even entertained. And now, the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Thank you. Hello and welcome to episode 47 of the Criminologist Podcast. Happy to have you all with us here today. If you listened to episode 45 a couple of weeks ago, you heard my awesome interview with Dr. Shad Maruna. I strongly encourage you to go back and listen to that episode if you have not yet heard it. One of the things that Shad and I talked about was a speech that he gave back in 2016 entitled A Positive Psychology of Imprisonment. A plea for Makinoshi's return. This was a speech he gave at the Wentworth Forensic Clinic Conference in New South Wales, Australia. Part of that speech talked about what Shad referred to as a transformation process. Specifically, how there are certain steps that different agencies and organization and others have used for centuries to instill change in human behavior. This is a very, very successful 6-step process, which I'm going to highlight in this episode. As I make that proclamation, though, some of you are likely thinking to yourselves, wow, this is great, Joe. Please share with us that secret formula to change so that we may start applying it with our justice-involved individuals that we work with. Well, the good news is I will do that. First, though, let me share with you all some of those historical illustrations that I referenced. That is, I will first highlight these 6 steps by way of their utilization in other settings. As you are about to learn, this technique has been successfully utilized by law enforcement agencies, the military, fraternities, sports teams, street gangs, and even organized crime, the mafia. What you may ask, do all these entities have in common? Well, they have all used this 6-step technique to drive, dare I say, control the behavior of its members. So here then are those 6 steps. Step number 1, the apprenticeship or journey. Step number 2, the ceremony. Step number 3, credentialism. Step number 4, renaming. Step number 5, inclusion in an exclusive subculture. And finally, step number 6, internalizing, also known as self-labeling. So let's take each one of those one by one. And we'll also go through several illustrations of the entities I referenced above, which use this tactic oh so successfully. Let us begin with how these 6 steps are utilized in the world of law enforcement, particularly at the federal level here in the United States. Or if you are one of our many international listeners, think of your specialized units in law enforcement. Here domestically, I'm thinking of the FBI, for example. So for the purposes of this first illustration, let's just go with the FBI. Think Agent Starling in Silence of the Lambs. So, as I noted, step number 1, the apprenticeship or journey. So, using the Federal Bureau of Investigation as our first template, if you will, all of those fledgling FBI agents begin their journey going through training in Quantico, Virginia. That is a 20-week program, a very grueling program. And this first step, this journey, if you will, is not uncommon in most vocations. Most trades, for example, plumbers, electricians, craftsmen, etc., they all require some type of apprenticeship. Step number 2, the ceremony. At the conclusion of their trek through the Quantico Academy in Virginia, there is, of course, a big graduation ceremony to commemorate this major accomplishment. And again, graduation ceremonies are used to signify major accomplishments in one's life. We are all likely familiar with the use of ceremonies in life. Step number 3, credentialism. In the FBI, you finally get your credentials, or your creds, as the agents refer to them, and your badge, of course. And again, in Silence of the Lambs, when Agent Starling got to this portion of her journey, recall Hannibal Lecter saying to her previously, "You're not real FBI," because she was still in training, recall. Well, she finally goes through the training, the ceremony, and the credentialing. Now she's real FBI. Step number 4 is what Shad refers to as the renaming. So here again, sticking with our FBI illustration, those individuals become special agents. Special agent Starling. You're a Fed, or back in the day, a G-Man, right? You go through this renaming. And then step number 5, inclusion in an exclusive subculture. Well, this is a very exclusive subculture, the FBI, particularly even within the law enforcement community. It's an extremely exclusive subculture, almost, dare I say, elitist subculture. And then finally, step number 6. So after the above 5 steps, the individual goes through some internalizing and some self-labeling occurs. This is where one starts seeing oneself as a Fed or a special agent, or like I said back in the day, a G-Man. And that is when the behavior change really kicks in. And so that was our first illustration of the 6-step process. At the conclusion, you have a dedicated FBI agent who behaves differently than they did prior to this process. The federal government utilizes this 6-step process to great effect with FBI agents, DEA, ATF, think all of the alphabet soup. And they do this because it works. Okay, our next illustration, let's look at how this is used in the military. And when I talk about how this is used in the military, in particular, I'm thinking of Special Forces units, the Navy SEALs, those, again, more elite military units that you may have in your jurisdictions. So let's go through those 6 steps again, looking at how these Special Forces units could use, or do use, I should say, these 6 steps. Number 1, the apprenticeship or journey. So getting through Navy SEALs training is absolutely brutal. 75% of the individuals who begin that journey do not finish what's referred to as basic underwater demolition, or BUDS. That's a 24-week program. And again, it's grueling. Most people don't get through. But if you get through, that does a lot to change behavior. That's followed by step number 2, a big graduation ceremony. Again, we talked about step number 2, ceremony previously. Step number 3, credentialism. Again, individuals, even in the military, who are in Special Forces, Navy SEALs, again, these elite units, they have a very special status. Navy SEALs, even apart from other members of the Navy, this really means something to have this credential. Step number 4, we talk about the renaming. In this circumstance, those individuals, they get a new handle, if you will. So I'm thinking Goose and Maverick from Top Gun, the elite fighter pilots rather. Their renaming was they took on that new handle, and that's how they were referred to. Next, inclusion in an exclusive subculture, step number 5. Again, a very exclusive subculture, even in the military community. Step number 6, the final step, Internalizing, also known as self-labeling. This is where one starts to view oneself as a SEAL or a Special Forces member. And again, that's when the behavior change really kicks in. The military does all of this to elicit certain behavior from the SEALs. They do this to great effect, and again, they do it because it works. Let's look at another example and maybe change our lens just a little bit from pro-social agencies and organizations that do this to antisocial organizations and agencies. Let's look at how this is used with street gangs or even, like I said, organized crime like the mafia. Step number 1, what does their apprenticeship journey look like? In street gangs, we're talking about members having to be jumped in or sexed in. In the mafia, we've all seen the movies where they talk about making your bones for the mafia. In other words, committing enough crimes to, again, prove oneself. But that's sort of that journey portion, if you will. Next, we have the ceremony, step number 2. Again, we've all seen the mafia movies where they have the secret ceremony in which they burn the patron saint in their hand and they swear a lifelong allegiance to the Cosa Nostra. Number 3, credentialing. Now you're no longer a prospect. Now you're a full member. Here I'm thinking if you've ever watched Sons of Anarchy or any of these so-called biker gang television shows, you've seen this where you get your full member patch, right? You go from a prospect to a full member. You receive credentialing. And then the renaming. Again, your new handle, your gang name or your moniker. And again, I can speak from experience having formerly supervised gang members. It's all about the moniker, the moniker, the moniker, the moniker. Or again, you've watched enough mafia movies to hear all the sort of street names. But again, this is done for a reason. They're doing this because this is step 4, the renaming, and they know this is going to help to drive the behavior that they're endeavoring to manage, if you will. Step number 5, inclusion in an exclusive subculture. Well, again, in the mafia, now you're a made man or a full member. And again, with street gangs, whether it's Crips or Bloods or Gangster Disciples or Vice Lords, now you're a member of this exclusive gang subculture that you see as your family, if you will. And then finally, step 6, internalizing and self-labeling. This is where one sees oneself as a gang member. 7-4 to the core. That was the GD, Gangster Disciple mantra that I remember from back in the day. But again, when that self-labeling kicks in and they see themselves as a member of this family, if you will, and again, they're no longer John Smith, but Tommy Two Times or whatever gang name they get, that really solidifies the behavior change. And this, again, results in gang member behavior. But it doesn't happen without all of those 6 steps being done to great effect. Let's take a look at one more kind of fun illustration, if you will. Think of fraternities. They do the exact same thing with these 6 steps. When you look at step 1, the apprenticeship or journey, that's when they go through the hazing rituals. And if you've ever seen the brilliant John Landis movie Animal House, you know all about hazing rituals, or just from pop culture or maybe firsthand, you know about hazing rituals and fraternities. That's their attempt to replicate step 1, the apprenticeship or journey. Step number 2, ceremony. Again, a secret swearing into the fraternity. They make a big deal of the ceremony because they know the effect it's going to have on that prospect, on that member. Step number 3, credentialism. Again, you're no longer a pledge. Now you're a full member. You're credentialed. Step number 4, the renaming. Again, recall the film Animal House. Their members went through the above steps, the hazing, the swearing in, being told that they were now moving from pledge to a full member, and then they were transformed into D-Day or Stork, Otter, Pinto, and Flounder. They gave them those fraternity names for a reason, because it fulfills step number 4, renaming. Next, step number 5, inclusion in an exclusive subculture. Again, the Deltas of Animal House, that was their exclusive subculture, or their rivals from across the street, the Omegas, for that matter. Again, fraternities do this to great effect. And then finally, step 6, that internalizing, or that self-labeling. Those individuals, they see themselves as Deltas or Omegas or whatever membership they belong to. They identified as Deltas. They identified as Omegas. And with all of these 6 steps, we get their behavior change, which again, I could reference the movie Animal House and all the wacky behaviors they engaged in, but I would contend those behaviors would not have kicked in without all 6 of these steps taking place.
A quick break from the show to give a shout out to our friends at APHIS, the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. APHIS is a professional organization dedicated to uniting the forensic communities of criminal justice, education, law, medicine, and psychology. APHIS is a leader in building relationships within the forensic community, locally and nationally. The mission of the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies is to provide quality education, training, consultation, and research in the forensic studies to professionals and students. APHIS is a leader in connecting members with one another to help facilitate professional growth, increased competency, and awareness in forensic mental health studies. For details as to upcoming training events, webinars, or publications, please visit them at www.aiafs.com. And now, back to the show.
Okay, so let's take another illustration here, one more of an entity that has really perfected the 6-step process in inducing behavior change, and that is the criminal justice system. Unfortunately, we're doing this for the worse in the criminal justice system, as I'm about to show you all. Step number 1, now that we're familiar with these, the apprenticeship or journey. This is really the initiation into criminality. Criminal acts are typically a social endeavor. Individuals prove themselves on this journey by committing their crimes, really. Step 2, the ceremony. Here, and again, I need to give total credit to Dr. Shad Maruna on this. Again, this is all based on his speech that he gave, and I've talked to him again on the podcast about this, so please go back and have a listen. But when we talk about this within the context of the criminal justice system, Shad refers to the courtroom as a status degradation ceremony. Again, do yourselves a favor and go down the Shad Maruna rabbit hole. He talks about deviant smithing versus normal smithing. And really, we know of the importance of ceremony to reinforce identities. And if you're a regular listener to the show, you know how important identity plays in the desistance process. Here, Shad contends, it also works on reinforcing the identity towards persistence. These degradation ceremonies versus accomplishment ceremonies. If any of you have ever been in a courtroom for any reason, particularly if you are a criminal justice practitioner, you know all about the formality and the decorum of appearing in court, whether it's entering a plea or a sentencing or probation violation after probation violation. Again, it's really this notion that these are really equivalent to what Shad refers to as status degradation ceremonies. We're not celebrating these accomplishments. We're degrading that individual. Again, just lots of ceremony and status in courtrooms. The sad thing is, positive recognition in the criminal justice system is rare. By its nature, it is almost entirely negative. When clients are rewarded on supervision, it is it's generally for something they did not do. And the reward is not having something done to them. For example, if you don't fail a drug test, you'll do less urinalysis testing, less drug testing. It's not so much about good behavior as engaging in not bad behavior. Positive client efforts towards employment, securing housing, educational achievements, sobriety, etc., they generally go unnoticed by the system. Shad contends that if police officers, judges, and wardens were to simply shake the hands of desisting ex-offenders and say, well done, well then the client would have to acknowledge some level of justice in the quote-unquote justice system. Again, in his book, Making Good, Shad talks about this rebiographing, if you will. If you grab the book, if you have the book, skip to page 164 and you'll learn all about that. Okay, back to the 6 steps. Step number 3, credentialism. Well, in the criminal justice system, this results in a formal and long-lasting classification, and it is one that allows society to officially and legitimately discriminate against the individuals by credentialing them by saying, you are now a convicted felon. And again, with that conviction goes almost license for society to discriminate against these people. Let's talk about step 4, the renaming. So after the status degradation ceremony and the credentialing, a new name is assigned, that of offender. And again, if you are a regular listener of the podcast, you know how much I've gone on and on about the use of that term and just sort of labeling. Lots of literature out there about labeling theory and how these labels have such a negative effect on the desistance process. Or, as I'm saying here, in this sort of bizarro world, how that renaming works in individuals persisting more in crime because, again, we slap on that term offender, and it sticks with them for years, if not longer, where we are really just looking at the worst thing somebody did on the worst day of their life and affixing that label to them for years and expecting them to change that behavior. Okay, step number 5, exclusive subculture, inclusion rather, within an exclusive subculture. By excluding from mainstream opportunities, excluding these individuals, convicted felons now, from mainstream opportunities, we embed that individual into a criminal subculture. And that, of course, gets worse in jails and prison, the whole subculture, or again, with gang membership. If you've seen the brilliant documentary that Shad Maruna and Fergus McNeil and others produced, you'll see the quote by a desisted individual at the end, the individual who's been given the OBE by the British government, and he talks about, hey, if you don't want me in your gang, I'm not going to be in your gang. Again, he's referencing the exclusive criminal subculture that we inadvertently create here and drive individuals into. And then finally, step number 6, internalizing or self-labeling. This is going from somebody who stole a car to a car thief, going from a person who is addicted to an addict. And it begins to instill a sense of hopelessness or accepting of one's fate. And then, of course, this really leads into the phenomenon of prisonization as well, again, where that internalizing and self-labeling kicks in. Again, I'm just giving a shout out here to Dr. Maruna. He has talked about the fact that in the risk needs responsivity model, when we look at dynamic risk factors, there's actually another dynamic risk factor, and that is, per Shad, imprisonment itself is criminogenic. Right? Imprisonment itself is criminogenic. He contends that the question shouldn't be how dangerous is this person, but rather how dangerous is imprisonment for this person? How much damage will another month of incarceration do to this individual? How then could we flip this script around and use this awesome 6-step process to promote desistance? Let's go through these 6 steps again in our sort of utopian world, best case scenario. Step number 1, the apprenticeship or journey. What are the positive rites of passage that we ask of our clients? How can they earn redemption? One illustration that Shad mentioned are the fire camps of California. So overall, there are approximately 3,700 inmates working at what are referred to fire camps in the state of California. All of these inmates receive the same entry-level training that California Fire's seasonal firefighters receive, in addition to ongoing training from the department, the Cal Fire Department, throughout the time that they're in the program. So I guess the question one would ask themselves is 6 months sitting in a cell or 6 months working as a volunteer firefighter? Which will have better outcomes? Another thing that we talk about here in our sort of wish list utopian world of how we could use these steps to promote desistance when we talk about apprenticeship and journey is a need for mentors. And again, if you listen to my episode 45 when I interviewed Dr. Maruna, he gave the great example of asking yourself, well, how do you get out of a minefield? What's the best way out of a minefield? You follow the footsteps of the person ahead of you who successfully got out of that minefield. Nobody learned to become a career criminal on their own, yet we expect them to rehabilitate on their own. This really speaks to the need for role models and mentors, specifically individuals with lived experience, which I feel is really sort of an untapped resource out there. Next, step number 2, ceremony. Let's ask ourselves, what would a ritual of redemption look like? We talked about the status degradation ceremonies. What would a delabeling ceremony look like? Again, the degradation ceremony is almost irreversible, yet, getting off supervision or getting off paper, as you may have heard the term, it really has with it no fanfare at all. Again, the individual might get a letter in the mail saying, congratulations, you're successfully discharged from probation supervision. But again, really no fanfare at all. How could we really use step number 2, ceremony, to promote desistance? Again, what would a delabeling ceremony look like? Well, in France, they have what are known as judicial rehabilitation ceremonies, to again sort of acknowledge an individual's pathway towards desistance. And I love this part of it. These ceremonies take place in the very same courtroom as that individual was sentenced in years earlier. These individuals are deemed to be rehabilitated. And this sort of legal magic carries weight in France. There's a reason we have all this pomp and ceremony at sentencings and convictions. Yet again, we don't undo that effect. We don't undo the effect of that status degradation ceremony. Perhaps we should. Let's look at step 3, credentialism. Well, this poses the question, how do we erase the criminal credential that we've so successfully instilled? Expungement? Maybe. But again, do we really have a non-criminal credential that we could leverage? I don't know. I know some states have what's called certificates of good conduct. This really gets at what Sampson and Loeb talk about, where they talk about knifing off one's past. Again, I feel we really need to formalize that credentialing when individuals are desisting from crime and moving on past supervision. Let's look at step number 4, renaming. Ask ourselves, do we have a word for somebody who is no longer, quote, an offender? I know we still use ex-con in that context to refer to someone, I guess as an ex-offender, but how successful is that really? I mean, picture yourself, the house across the street goes up for sale and when it's sold and folks in the neighborhood are sort of gossiping about the new neighbors. If you were to hear that the individual moving in is an ex-offender, I don't feel your reaction would have been, oh, thank God it's not an offender. It's an ex-offender. Oh, perfect. Then no worries. Again, I don't really think we have language out there to signify what that means, or what that renaming, that carries more weight than that. The other issue is, and we know this with the desistance literature, it's really hard to know when this occurs as well. Let's look at step number 5. Here, if we're flipping it around, we're really endeavoring to get social inclusion, right? Rather than inclusion in a subculture, we want social inclusion to welcome them back to mainstream society. I'm quoting Trassler here from 1980, quote, "As they grow older, most young men gain access to other sources of achievement and social satisfaction. A job, a girlfriend, a wife, a home, and eventually children. And in doing so, become gradually less dependent upon peer group support." Again, that really feeds into that social inclusion piece. Again, I mentioned Sampson and Lobb earlier. They refer to, quote, "a steady job and the love of a good woman." Really sort of moving out of the pack and into the family, pro-social family, it's really one of the best predictors of desisting from crime. So maybe that's what we can do a better job with step 5, social inclusion, recognizing that and leveraging that. Finally, we have step number 6. This was, again, internalizing or self-labeling. Well, maybe we're looking at internalization of a new pro-social identity here. This all culminates, again, in the all-important identity transformation. We can't just tell our clients to think differently. Stop thinking like that. Stop thinking like this. We're social creatures. We go through a process. It's got stages, a journey. And I think that's what that journey looks like, concluding in a desisted pro-social individual. But I think that's really sort of the next challenge for desistance champions. How can we operationalize, if you will, these 6 steps to promote desistance rather than, sadly, as we're doing it now, using those 6 steps to really promote persistence? Okay, in the coming weeks, I'm going to continue to illustrate these themes. Ideally, I might try to take a stab at operationalizing some of these steps by way of our fictitious clients that we supervise here on the show. I will, again, like I said, attempt to operationalize these 6 steps and model those for you as best I can. We really need to pick up as well where we left off and do a deeper dive on what's known as narrative therapy. Maybe even do a deep dive on the emerging field out there of narrative criminology. And a lot of that is based on the work of Fergus McNeil and others. Okay, back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, for training or presentations as to evidence-based practices or implementation, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email, thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook page and or Instagram page at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to our feeds. You don't want to miss out on those. The Criminologist Media Group is now on Twitter. You can follow the Criminologist Media Group on Twitter at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group, at Crim Media Group, our Twitter handle. Go ahead and give us a follow. You can also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content related to the themes of this podcast. In fact, I'm going to conclude the show with a fun little parody that I did, which if you like what you hear, jump on over to YouTube and check out the YouTube video version of this commercial parody that you're about to hear. Coffee mugs are available, merchandise, reach out to the show for more details. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the show, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us. Tired of those pesky risk factors? Fed up with those nagging periods of reoffending? Just can't seem to keep on the straight and narrow? Then try Criminogard. Criminogard is our patented repellent against criminogenic need. Criminogard is effective against the risk factors of delinquent past, dysfunctional family relationships, substance misuse, lack of pro-social leisure activities, deficits around education and employment, negative peers, pro-criminal attitude, and a history of antisocial personality pattern. Simply apply Criminogard at the onset of delinquent behavior or when actuarial risk assessment warrants application. Criminogard works by attacking criminogenic need at the source while buffering against future risk. Inspired by general personality and cognitive social learning theory, Criminogard identifies criminogenic need at its source. Then our top secret byproducts mimic prosocial modeling to elicit the onset of prosocial behavior. Once the cost for antisocial behavior outweighs the rewards, users begin seeing reductions in criminal deeds. Criminogard is available in regular, mint, or jasmine scent. Find Criminogard at all quality vendors, shops, and strip malls. Criminogard is not a substitute for proven evidence-based practices. Criminogard may cause mild discomfort or skin rash. In case of continued maladaptive behavior, users should subject themselves to proven core correctional practices. Criminogard has failed to result in significant effect sizes in recidivism reduction. Buyer beware, not sold in Canada.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, training opportunities, or to contact the host, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. Click on the Contact Us tab in the upper right-hand side of the page. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.